There's a kind of skepticism that looks sophisticated, but it's actually lazy. It says maybe you're not really knowing anything. Maybe you're just having experiences or constructing narratives or trapped in language. Lonergan's reply is not a slogan, but it's actually an act. He says, if you want objectivity, you eventually have to force a concrete question of fact, one that cannot be outsourced to anyone else. Am I a knower? Not, do I have opinions? Not, do I have impressions? Not, do I sometimes feel certain? Am I actually performing the operations that make knowledge possible, experiencing, understanding, reflecting, and judging? Because if you can't responsibly affirm that you are a knower, then every later talk of objectivity is mere floating. And if you can responsibly affirm it, you have taken a decisive step. You've grounded objectivity where it has to be grounded, in the subject's own cognitional life. So today's goal is simple and demanding. We are going to walk through Lonergan's self-affirmation of the knower. We will see why it is a judgment of fact, how it is justified, why it matters for objectivity, and why it is hard, because human consciousness is polymorphic and most of our living is not spent in the intellectual pattern. Now, let me place this episode in the arc of the series. In episode 9, we introduced judgment, when you can responsibly say yes. In episode 10, we focused on reflective understanding, how you grasp the sufficiency of evidence. Now in episode 11, it turns to the same structure inward, not as introspection in the cheap sense, but as a rigorous judgment of fact about the one knower you cannot avoid being responsible for, yourself. And it's not some sort of form of narcissism, it's method. If you want a critical realism that is an intelligent and reasonable realism, you have to break the naive assumption that knowing is basically taking a good look at what is already out there now. And you have to break it not by replacing it with a new theory, but by appropriating what you're actually doing when you know. So, when people hear the word consciousness, they often picture an inner theater, a little screen inside your head. You look inward and there are thoughts. You look outward and there are things, and consciousness is a container. Lonergan refuses this picture entirely. He doesn't deny inner experience, but he thinks the theater metaphor misleads us. Consciousness is not primarily an object that you stare at. It is the presence to self that accompanies your acts, seeing, hearing, imagining, inquiring, understanding, formulating, reflecting, judging. You can miss a lot about yourself if you try to treat consciousness as if it were just another thing to observe. The key is to attend to operations as you perform them. So the first step is to notice that conscious acts have different kinds of awareness. There's empirical consciousness, the level of experiencing what you see, what you hear, imagine, remember, what you feel. There is intelligent consciousness, the level of inquiry and understanding, questions for intelligence and the insights that answer them. And then there is rational consciousness, the level of reflection and judgment, questions for reflection and the grasp of sufficient reason that warrants yes or no. And these three are different substances. They are not three little selves that are separate. They are differentiations within one field of consciousness. And the whole book so far has been training you to recognize these acts from within your own experience. Because the whole problem of modern philosophy is that people talk about knowing while failing to notice what they do not when they know. Now, notice the next move. These acts and contents don't float as disconnected atoms. They actually coalesce into unities. What is perceived is what is inquired about. What is inquired about is what is understood. What is understood is what is formulated. What is formulated is what is reflected on. And what is reflected on is what is grasped as unconditioned. And what is grasped as unconditioned is what is affirmed. That may sound like poetry, it's not. That's more of a report. It's what happens when your knowing is working. And Lonergan insists that this reveals a unity on the side of the subject. Because if the acts did not belong together in one field, how could inquiry be about your precepts? How could insight be into your images? How could reflective grasp combined condition that is thought with a fulfillment that is given in experience? How could judgment arise out of that combination? This unity is not an inward look that spots a mysterious entity called the self. No. It's given in the very fact that your knowing is one process, not a pile of fragments. And now, we're close to the core. If there is one consciousness, at once empirical, intelligent, rational, then the I is not a theoretical construct. It can't be. It has a rudimentary meaning from consciousness itself prior to your having a perfect definition. You already know, obscurely but firmly, what I refers to because you live as a unity of diverse acts. Yes, you can try out different definitions of the self and you can find faults with them precisely because there is an underlying familiarity with the unity they're trying to name. That's important. That's important because self-affirmation is not going to be built on a definition that you memorize. It's going to be built on the structure of a judgment of fact, grounded in your own conscious operations. So now, we ask the question that all this should lead to. Am I a knower? Lonergan is quite emphatic here. Each has to ask it for himself. And if you ask the question, am I a knower? Seriously, honestly, what you immediately discover is something about yourself. Simply to ask, am I a knower, is not merely to repeat the words. That's why I said to do it seriously. What it is to enter the state of rational consciousness in which dissatisfaction with mere theory becomes a demand for fact, for what is so. It is a question for reflection. The judgment, it calls for yes or no. And that means it calls for sufficient reason, for a reflective grasp of the virtually unconditioned. So, that should be familiar. And because of that, let's use episode 10's structure. Every responsible judgment of fact rests on a grasp of the virtually unconditioned. There is a conditioned. There is a link between the conditioned and its conditions. There is the fulfillment of the conditions. When those three are grasped together, the conditioned becomes virtually unconditioned. And then the yes is warranted. Lonergan applies that structure directly to self-affirmation. The conditioned is the prospective judgment. I am a knower. I am a knower. That is the prospective judgment. The link, though, what is the link? Well, the link can be stated in a simple conditional form. I am a knower if I am a unity performing certain kinds of acts. So, the conditions, I am a knower, are twofold. First, the unity, this I, as a unity identity whole, given in the field of consciousness. Second, the acts, do I perform acts of experiencing, understanding, reflecting, judging? Now, the crucial point is how the fulfillment of those conditions is given. It's not given by an argument that begins from premises about psychology or metaphysics. It's given by reverting from formulation to the more rudimentary level where there's not yet a theory, but simply the lived performance of the acts themselves. You do not prove you are a knower by constructing an image of yourself thinking. And that should be obvious. It seems ridiculous, no? You prove it by noticing that you are in fact seeing, that you are in fact hearing, inquiring, understanding, reflecting, judging reasonably. So what Lonergan is doing is, is something really concrete. He runs a checklist. And it's not a checklist as an external test, but as a set of questions that brings you back to the data of your own conscious life. What is that? What is this checklist that he runs, this external test? Do I see or am I blind? Do I hear or am I deaf? Do I try to understand? Or is the distinction between intelligence and stupidity no more applicable to me than to a stone? Do I have any experience of insight? Or is the story of Archimedes as strange to me as a myth with no counterpart in my life? Nothing to compare it to. It's meaningless. Do I conceive, define, formulate? Or is my talking like a parrot talking? And then I reflect. For I am asking whether I am a knower. Do I grasp the unconditioned? If not, in other instances, then in this one? So in other words, can I reach here and now a reflective grasp that compels affirmation? Now, watch carefully, watch the turn. You might be expecting that this is where the argument becomes fragile. No, there may be that intuition that's emerging in your mind now. But Lonergan's move precisely here is quite sharp. The very fact that you can ask these questions of yourself and the fact that you can answer them from within your own conscious performance is already sufficient reason for the affirmative answer. Because to ask the question seriously is already to be operating rationally, and to answer it by attending to the acts is to find the conditions fulfilled. So self-affirmation is a judgment of fact in itself. It is not a metaphysical deduction. It is not a linguistic convention. It is not some sort of psychological hypothesis. A judgment of fact grounded in the data of consciousness itself. Now, maybe at this point, you may feel a bit of resistance. You may say something like, that sounds a bit too easy. Surely skeptical doubt can always undercut that. And Lonergan will say, yes, people do undercut it. But notice how they do it. They do not do it by a better judgment grounded in better evidence. They do it by shifting patterns of consciousness and then treating the standards of one pattern as if they were binding to another. Can't do that. This is where polymorphic consciousness enters. That sounds complex, verbose. Human consciousness is polymorphic, more than one form. The pattern in which it flows Remember our previous episodes. Could be biological, aesthetic, artistic, dramatic, practical, intellectual, and so on. These patterns alternate. They mix. They interfere. They conflict. They break down. The intellectual pattern, the pattern in which we inquire, we understand, we reflect, and judge, does not dominate our lives automatically. So it is no wonder when posed with questions of reflective judgment that we shift into more default patterns. No one is born into the intellectual pattern. No one reaches it easily, nor is it promised. No one remains in the intellectual pattern permanently. And when another pattern is dominant, the self of self-affirmation can feel unreal, like a philosopher's abstraction. The universe of being can seem as unreal as a platonic heaven, and objectivity can shrink back into what feels obvious, dealing with persons and things that are really out there. So that means, what's the difficulty? Well, there is a difficulty, and the difficulty is not that the self-affirmation is logically weak. It's not logically weak. The difficulty is that it is existentially hard to live in the pattern in which it becomes luminous. You may be intellectually convinced in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you're working under stress, prideful, hungry, fatigued, maybe angry or agitated, and you revert to the already out there now real. The already out there now real objectivity as the only thing that feels solid, that's tangible. And then you'll be tempted to treat the intellectual pattern as just mere theory, precisely because you are no longer operating within it. You cannot see beyond the horizon of the pattern in which you've shifted into. This is why Lonergan thinks that self-appropriation is not a one-shot event. It can't be. It's an achievement that has to be stabilized against the polymorphic drift of consciousness. Now, Lonergan adds a further refinement that matters for objectivity. He says self-affirmation has overtones. It's not only a judgment of fact, it has a kind of immanent normativity. Okay, what does that mean? And if you take that as so, you may ask, okay, why though? Why? Why it has a kind of immanent normativity? Well, because if you affirm that you are indeed a knower, you are not just stating, I have experiences. That's not just what you're doing. You are affirming that you are a kind of subject who is bound by the norms of that are immanent in the cognitional process. If you are a knower, then you are under the obligation to be attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible. They sound like moral slogans that are imposed from the outside in. They're not. That's not at all what they are. What they actually are the inner law of knowing itself. Because the structure that gets you to the truth is not arbitrary. It must be normative. It demands fidelity. It must be so. So the self-affirmation of the knower is not only a foundational yes, it's also a commitment, whether you like it or not, to the disciplines of inquiry and reflection. Now, in Insight, Lonergan makes another move that prevents a common misunderstanding that often arises when people read this. He distinguishes description and explanation. Description is common sense talk about what we experience. Explanation is the scientific or theoretical account that introduces explanatory terms and relations. And the temptation is to say, if the self is not an object of descriptive inner perception, then self-knowledge is impossible. Lonergan has a reply to that. And Lonergan's reply is, you are confusing modes. The unity of consciousness is given, but not as an object of inward looking. It is given as the one field in which the operations occur themselves. And self-affirmation is indeed grounded, but it's grounded not in a description of the inner object, but in the explanatory appropriation of your own operations of knowing. So, self-affirmation is not an empirical hypothesis about a hidden entity called the self. It's a reflective judgment. It's a reflective judgment grounded in the data of consciousness and clarified by cognitional analysis. Now comes one of the most provocative claims. Lonergan argues that radical revision of this cognitional structure is impossible. And he does not mean that you can't revise your psychological theories. Doesn't mean that you can't change or revise your philosophy or your metaphysics. Of course you can. Do it all the time. So then, what does he mean that radical revision of the cognitional structure is impossible? He means something far more precise. What he says is, any genuine revision appeals to data. It claims earlier theory did not account for all of the data. It claims new insights have been reached. It claims new statements are unconditioned, or closer to the unconditioned than the old. But if that is what revision is, then revision presupposes the three levels: experience, understanding, and judgment. It presupposes the cumulative, self-correcting process of learning. It presupposes reflective grasp of the unconditioned. So, revision cannot revise its own presuppositions. A reviser cannot appeal to data to deny data. He cannot invoke new insights to deny insights. He cannot use reflective grasp to deny reflective grasp. In other words, if you attempt to refute the structure of knowing by the very acts that constitute knowing, you refute your refutation. And this has direct consequences for relativism, and we should be able to intuit that now. We should be able to have an insight. A popular relativism says, science is the best knowledge we have. Science is always revisable. Therefore, all knowledge is always revisable. Lonergan's answer is, that argument is fallacious. Because you know that science is revisable, you must already know some invariant features of knowing. And if you know invariant features of knowing, then you know something that is not subject for revision. So, self-affirmation is not a fragile foundation. It's an instance of an invariant structure. The only possible way a judgment of fact can be grounded is by a grasp of the virtually unconditioned. And self-affirmation is precisely such a judgment of fact. So, one may at this point ask the question, why does this all matter for objectivity? Well, it matters for objectivity because it blocks a disastrous alternative that has haunted modern thought, one that I've written much about. On the one hand, there is the realism of extroverted animal consciousness, the world is already out there now. On the other hand, there is the realism of rational affirmation. Objectivity is achieved through the operations of knowing, through judgment grounded in sufficient reason. Both are realisms. Both have their ground. But if you fail to distinguish the two types of knowing, the two types of realisms become absolutely incompatible. We simply cannot bridge them. Rational affirmation is not extroversion. It cannot be objective in the way already out there now is objective. It can't. And the flow of sensations and images is not intelligent or reasonable. It cannot be knowledge in the way science and philosophy are knowledge. So what does that mean? It means that if you try to fuse them without differentiating between them, you end up canceling both. And when both are canceled, you oscillate between materialism and idealism, or you collapse into some cultured form of skepticism. Lonergan's solution is to distinguish the types of knowing within polymorphic consciousness, and then to ground objectivity in the intelligent and reasonable operations of the knower. And that grounding begins not with abstract theory, but with self-affirmation. I am a knower. Now, that's a lot, and I think at this point it helps to say explicitly what self-affirmation is not, the via negativa, in order that we clarify what we're trying to get at. Self-affirmation is not a self-congratulatory mantra. It's not a claim that you never err, that you never make a mistake. In fact, it's the exact opposite. To affirm that you are a knower is to affirm that you can be wrong in a meaningful way. Because you can miss data. We do. You can overlook questions. We do all the time. We jump to conclusions, rationalize. We flee from understanding. All of that can happen in very meaningful ways. Only a knower can have error in the strict sense. And the point of affirming that you are a knower is to become responsible for the norms that correct error. So, self-affirmation is the beginning of humility, not the end of doubt. It does not annihilate the need for method. What it does is it establishes why method matters. Now, let's return to polymorphic consciousness and make it practical, as we do in all our episodes. Because this is where people either get Lonergan or drop him. And unfortunately, most do the dropping than the getting. If consciousness were always in the intellectual pattern, self-affirmation would feel trivial. But we live in multiple patterns, and the world looks different in each of them. So, in practical terms, real means what works, what resists, what gets results. Under pressure, you will be tempted to treat truth as utility, as usefulness. In the dramatic pattern, real means what signals loyalty or threat, shame or pride, belonging or exclusion. Under conflict, under pressure, you will be tempted to treat emotional force as certainty. In the aesthetic pattern, real means what appears, what resonates, what fits. Under magnificent beauty, you may confuse that vividness with truth. And in the biological pattern, real means what meets appetite and avoids pain. Under exhaustion or fear, the field shrinks. And Lonergan's point is not to condemn any of this. These patterns are part of human life. His point is that objectivity, in the strict sense, objectivity as truth, is achieved only through the full cognitional process of experience, understanding, and judgment. So, the journey to objectivity is complicated because the subject is complicated. There are many patterns that we live in, that we move through. It's dynamic, and that's why our consciousness is polymorphic. So that means the critical task is to learn to return again and again to the intellectual and rational operations when you are making claims about what is, when we are talking about making those judgments. So here's a simple way to live this chapter without turning it into therapy speak. When you feel yourself pulled into a skeptical mood, you say something like, maybe none of this is real. Maybe I'm trapped in my head. Maybe like a simulation argument. Don't argue with the mood at the level of mood. Ask the question as a question for reflection in the other pattern. Ask, am I a knower? Am I right now operating empirically, intelligently, rationally? Can I attend to the data? Can I ask relevant questions? Have insights? Reflect on evidence? Can I make judgments? If you can, then the skepticism is not an intellectual position. It's a pattern shift. And the remedy then, obviously, is not to win a debate. It's to re-enter the operations of knowing. And conversely, when you feel the naive realism of immediacy, the only real is what's right here, what I can touch, don't insult it. Don't feel bad about it. Acknowledge that pattern's power. Then ask, am I confusing the criterion of the biological and common sense pattern with the criterion of truth? What would I affirm if I returned to inquiry, if I returned to understanding, if I returned to judgment? That is what self-affirmation makes possible. It's not a constant, lofty attitude, but a stable base you can return to when consciousness becomes protean. So, let me close with the core claim in one clean line. Self-affirmation of the knower is a judgment of fact that you are a unified subject performing the operations of experiencing, understanding, and judging. And that judgment matters because it grounds objectivity in the only place it can be grounded, in the intelligent and reasonable structure of cognitive life. Now, in the next episode, as usual, we will push forward. If you can affirm that you are a knower, then you can also ask what you are knowing toward. Lonergan calls it the notion of being, unrestricted, pervasive, puzzling, and it is the hinge between cognitive theory and metaphysics. So if this episode helped you, like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notifications bell so you don't miss what comes next.